He wasn't supposed to be a hero that night. Jake Morrison had spent 12 years running from the last time he tried to save someone. The night a man died because of his choices. The night that sent him to prison and cost him everything. But when the black limousine crashed through the bridge railing and plunged into the frozen Hudson River, he had 30 seconds to decide. Dive in or walk away like he'd been doing for years. The water was so cold, it burned. He could hear his daughter's voice in his head from that morning. "The kids say you're a criminal, Dad. I'm ashamed of you." His hands were shaking when he pulled the blonde woman from the sinking car, when he pressed his mouth to hers and breathed life back into lungs that had given up. She opened her eyes, blue, cold, expensive, and the flash of cameras exploded around them. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know she was Charlotte Ashford, the billionaire heiress whose father owned half of Manhattan. He didn't know that saving her life would drag him back into the exact darkness he'd been trying to escape. All he knew was this: the kiss that saved her life was about to destroy his. The bridge had been crowded that evening, the kind of rush-hour chaos that made Jake want to turn off his rideshare app and just go home. He'd already driven 11 hours that day, ferrying businessmen to LaGuardia and tourists to Times Square, his lower back aching from sitting in the same position for too long. His daughter Lily was waiting at after-school care, probably the last kid there again, and he'd promised himself he wouldn't be late this time. He was 3 minutes from the exit when he saw it happen in his rearview mirror. The black limousine was in the far lane, sleek and expensive, in a way that made Jake's 12-year-old sedan look like a tin can. The truck came from nowhere, a massive 18-wheeler that jackknifed on a patch of black ice and slammed into the limo's rear quarter panel with the sound of thunder cracking open the sky. The limousine spun twice, its tires screaming against asphalt, before it hit the bridge railing and kept going. Metal tore, glass shattered, and then there was just the terrible silence of something heavy disappearing into dark water. Jake's foot hit the brake before his brain caught up. Around him, cars were stopping, doors opening, people pulling out phones to record instead of help. He could see the limousine sinking fast, its headlights creating an eerie glow beneath the surface of the Hudson. The water temperature was probably 35 degrees, maybe less. Anyone trapped inside had minutes at most before hypothermia shut down their organs. Jake sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white, and thought about the last time he'd tried to be a hero. It had been a different kind of night, a different kind of mistake, but the ending had been the same. Someone died, and Jake went to prison for 9 years. He could drive away right now. No one would blame him. He wasn't a cop or a firefighter or anyone qualified to handle this kind of emergency. He was just a 35-year-old ex-convict trying to make rent and keep his daughter from hating him. But then he thought about Lily's face that morning when she'd asked him why the other kids said he was a bad person, and something in his chest cracked open. Jake kicked off his shoes, threw his phone on the driver's seat, and ran for the bridge railing. The jump felt like falling into knives. The cold hit him so hard he forgot how to breathe, his lungs seizing up as the Hudson swallowed him whole. He forced his eyes open in the murky darkness and kicked toward the sinking limousine, his arms already going numb. The driver's side window was shattered, and he could see a figure slumped against the steering wheel, not moving. In the back seat, a woman in a cream-colored dress floated like a ghost, her blonde hair spreading around her face in a halo. Jake grabbed the door handle and pulled, his muscles screaming in protest. But the water pressure made it nearly impossible. He braced his feet against the car frame and yanked with everything he had left. The door gave way suddenly, sending him tumbling backward, and he grabbed the woman's arm before the current could pull her away. She was small and light in the water, her skin already turning blue, and Jake kicked toward the surface with her body pressed against his chest. His vision was starting to blur at the edges, black spots dancing in front of his eyes, but he could see the lights above, street lamps and headlights, and the flashing red of emergency vehicles finally arriving. He broke the surface, gasping, his arm hooked under the woman's chin to keep her face above water, and someone was shouting instructions from the bridge. Strong hands reached down to pull them both onto the concrete embankment. And Jake collapsed next to the woman, his whole body shaking so violently he couldn't control it. She wasn't breathing. Jake rolled her onto her side, water streaming from her mouth and nose, and his hands moved on autopilot, tilting her head back, checking for a pulse, starting chest compressions with a rhythm he'd learned in prison from a cellmate who used to be a paramedic. 30 compressions, 2 rescue breaths. He pressed his mouth to hers, felt the coldness of her lips, tasted river water and something expensive like champagne. Her chest rose and fell with his breath, but she still wasn't breathing on her own. Around him, people were recording everything, their phones held up like offerings to some invisible god of viral content. Jake ignored them and kept going, counting compressions out loud, his voice hoarse and desperate. Come on, he thought. Come on, come on, come on. He'd already failed to save someone once in his life. He couldn't do it again. Not today. Not when his daughter was waiting for him to prove he was more than the sum of his mistakes. On the 43rd compression, the woman's eyes flew open. She coughed violently, water spilling from her mouth, and her hand shot up to grab Jake's wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes were the palest blue he'd ever seen, like winter sky reflected in ice, and they stared at him with a mixture of confusion and terror. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jake was aware of his hand still on her chest, of the way her wet dress clung to her body, of the absolute silence that had fallen over the crowd around them. Then she coughed again and turned her head to vomit water onto the concrete. And the moment broke. Paramedics swarmed in, wrapping her in thermal blankets and checking her vitals, and Jake stumbled backward into the crowd. His teeth were chattering so hard he bit his tongue, tasting blood, and someone threw a scratchy emergency blanket over his shoulders. The woman was being loaded onto a stretcher now, still conscious, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found his face again. She stared at him for 3 long seconds before the ambulance doors closed, and Jake had the strangest feeling that his life had just changed in a way he didn't understand yet. The police wanted a statement. Jake sat in the back of a patrol car with the heater blasting, wrapped in 2 more blankets, and answered questions in a monotone voice. No, he didn't know the woman. Yes, he'd just reacted without thinking. No, he didn't need to go to the hospital. He was fine, just cold. The officer taking his statement looked at him with something between respect and pity, which made Jake want to crawl out of his skin. He wasn't a hero. He was just someone who'd been in the right place at the right time, or maybe the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on how you looked at it. When they finally let him go, his car was still parked on the bridge, and his phone was buzzing with 47 missed calls from the after-school program. It was 7:30. Lily had been waiting for 2.5 hours. Jake drove there with his hair still dripping and his clothes leaving wet marks on the seat, his hands shaking on the steering wheel from more than just the cold. Lily was 8 years old, small for her age, with dark hair that always seemed to escape from whatever ponytail or braid he attempted. She was sitting alone in the playroom when he arrived, her backpack clutched in her lap, and the look she gave him was pure, exhausted disappointment. The program director, a kind woman named Ruth, who'd been patient with Jake's late pickups before, pulled him aside and told him gently that this couldn't keep happening. Jake nodded and apologized, and promised to do better, knowing even as he said it, that promises from men like him didn't mean much. In the car, Lily sat in silence for the first 5 minutes, staring out the window at the dark street sliding past. Then she said quietly, without looking at him, that Madison's mom had told Madison that Jake was a criminal, that he'd been in jail, and that Madison wasn't allowed to come over for playdates anymore. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He wanted to tell her that Madison's mom was wrong, but that would be a lie. and he'd promised himself when he got out of prison that he would never lie to his daughter. Instead, he said, "I made mistakes, Lily. Bad mistakes. A long time ago. And I went to jail because of them. That's true." Lily turned to look at him then, her eyes, dark like her mother's, nothing like his, searching his face for something he wasn't sure he could give her. "Are you a bad person?" she asked, and Jake felt something crack open in his chest, right where the old scar tissue from 9 years of regret had built up. He thought about the man who died because of his choices. About the security guard who'd been 62 years old and just 3 months from retirement. He thought about the woman he'd pulled from the river tonight, still alive because he'd jumped when he could have walked away. "I don't know," he said finally, and it was the most honest answer he had. When they got home to their tiny apartment in Queens, Jake made Lily a dinner of chicken nuggets and frozen vegetables while his phone buzzed continuously on the counter. Messages from numbers he didn't recognize, news notifications, voicemails piling up. He ignored all of it until Lily was in bed, and then he finally looked at his phone and felt his stomach drop. The video had already gone viral. Someone had filmed the whole thing. The limousine going over the railing, Jake diving in after it, the CPR on the embankment, the moment when the woman's eyes had opened and found his face. The headline on the local news site read, "Ex-con saves billionaire heiress in dramatic river rescue." Below it was his mugshot from 12 years ago, young and angry-looking, next to a recent photo someone had taken of him, soaking wet on the bridge, looking like a drowned rat wrapped in emergency blankets. They'd found out about his past in less than 3 hours. Of course they had. Nothing stayed buried in the age of instant information. Jake clicked on the article with a sense of creeping dread and learned that the woman he'd saved was Charlotte Ashford, only daughter of William Ashford, who owned half the commercial real estate in Manhattan and had a net worth somewhere in the billions. She was 28 years old, Princeton educated, and apparently on her way home from a charity gala when the accident happened. The article went on to detail Jake's criminal history, the robbery, the security guard's heart attack, the 9 years in Sing Sing. By morning, every parent at Lily's school would have read this. By morning, his daughter would be even more ashamed of him than she already was. Jake didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city through his thin walls, sirens and car horns, and someone shouting in Spanish 3 floors down. He thought about getting in his car and driving somewhere far away, starting over in a place where no one knew his name or his history. But he'd tried that before, and it never worked. The past always found you eventually. At 6 in the morning, there was a knock on his door. Jake looked through the peephole and saw a woman in an expensive black coat standing in his dingy hallway, flanked by a man in a suit who looked like he could bench press a car. Jake opened the door with the chain still attached and said, "Can I help you?" The woman stepped closer, and even through the 4-inch gap, he could see that her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky reflected in ice. It was her. Charlotte Ashford, in his hallway, looking at him like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "I came to thank you," she said, her voice cool and controlled, the kind of voice that came from expensive private schools and years of media training. "You saved my life?" Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he just stood there like an idiot until Charlotte added, "May I come in?" He unlatched the chain and opened the door wider, suddenly aware of how small and shabby his apartment must look to someone like her. The living room was barely 10 feet across, with a sagging couch he'd bought at Goodwill and a television older than his daughter. Lily's homework was spread across the coffee table, and there were dishes in the sink that he hadn't gotten around to washing. Charlotte walked in like she was entering a museum, her eyes taking in every detail, while the bodyguard stayed in the hallway, arms crossed. "I wanted to give you this," Charlotte said, pulling an envelope from her coat pocket. "It's not much, but I don't want your money," Jake interrupted, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. Charlotte raised one elegant eyebrow. "You don't even know how much it is." "Doesn't matter," Jake said. "I didn't pull you out of that river for a reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Something flickered across Charlotte's face. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. She studied him for a long moment, and Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him, past the defensive walls he'd built up over 12 years, down to the guilty, broken thing underneath. "You're the first person who's ever turned down my money," she said finally. "The first person who's ever looked at me like I'm not a checkbook with legs." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gaze. "I looked at you like a drowning woman. That's all." Charlotte smiled then, a small, sad thing that didn't reach her eyes. "Do you know what it's like?" she said quietly. "To wake up in an ambulance and realize that a stranger cared more about whether you lived or died than anyone in your actual life. The first thing my uncle said when he visited me in the hospital was that I'd ruined a $500,000 vehicle." Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Charlotte set the envelope on his coffee table anyway, right next to Lily's math homework. "Keep it," she said. "Donate it. Throw it away. I don't care. But I needed to come here and look you in the eye and say thank you." She turned to leave, and Jake found himself saying, "Wait." Charlotte paused in the doorway, looking back at him over her shoulder. "The driver," Jake said. "The one who was unconscious in the front seat. Did he make it?" Charlotte's expression went carefully blank. "He didn't." The words hit Jake like a fist to the stomach. He'd been so focused on the woman in the back seat, so desperate to save someone, anyone, after failing 12 years ago, that he hadn't even tried to get the driver out. He'd left him there to drown in the dark. Charlotte must have seen something in his face, because she added quickly, "He was already gone. The impact broke his neck. Even if you'd pulled him out first, there was nothing anyone could have done." But Jake barely heard her. He was back in the river, back in that moment when he'd seen two bodies and made a choice. He'd chosen her because she was closer, or maybe because she was alive, and the driver was clearly dead. Or maybe, and this was the thought that made him want to vomit, because she was rich and beautiful, and the driver was just the help. Charlotte took a step back into the apartment, her heels clicking on the worn linoleum. "Hey," she said, her voice softer now. "This is not your fault. You saved a life, that matters." But Jake was already shaking his head, backing away from her, from the envelope full of money, from the woman who represented everything he'd tried to leave behind. "You should go," he said, his voice coming out strangled. Charlotte hesitated, looked like she wanted to say something else, but then the bodyguard cleared his throat meaningfully from the hallway. She gave Jake one last searching look and left, the sound of her expensive heels echoing in the stairwell long after she'd gone. Jake stood alone in his living room, staring at the envelope on his coffee table, and felt the weight of it like a stone in his chest. He picked it up, considered throwing it away like she'd suggested, then opened it instead. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a handwritten note in elegant script. "For your daughter's future. You gave me mine back. Thank you, CA." Jake sat down on his sagging couch and put his head in his hands. The money could change everything for Lily. Better schools, college fund, a way out of this neighborhood where gunshots woke you up at night, and the elevator never worked. But taking it felt like admitting that he'd saved Charlotte's life for a reward, like putting a price tag on doing the right thing. He was still sitting there when Lily came out of her bedroom in her school uniform, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She saw the check in his hand and asked, "What's that?" Jake folded it quickly and shoved it back in the envelope. "Nothing. Just junk mail." But Lily was 8, not stupid, and she looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes that sometimes made him feel like she was the parent, and he was the child. "Was that the lady from the river?" she asked. "The one on the news?" Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. Lily sat down next to him on the couch, her small body pressed against his side, and said, "Madison's mom showed her the video at breakfast. She said you're a hero." Jake looked down at his daughter, at the way she was trying to smile even though he could see the uncertainty in her eyes, and felt something break open inside him. "I'm not a hero, Lily," he said quietly. "I just did what anyone should have done." "But nobody else did," Lily pointed out with the simple logic of a child. "Everybody just stood there with their phones." "You jumped in." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Jake wrapped his arm around her, this tiny person who was the only good thing he'd ever made in his entire life. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she whispered, and Jake had to close his eyes against the sudden burning behind them. The next week passed in a blur of unwanted attention. News crews showed up at Jake's apartment building, asking for interviews. His phone rang constantly with numbers he didn't recognize. Reporters, talk show producers, someone from a podcast about everyday heroes. Jake ignored all of it and tried to go back to his normal routine. But normal didn't exist anymore. Other drivers recognized him at red lights. Passengers getting into his car would do double takes and ask if he was that guy from the bridge. Lily's school called to say that some parents were concerned about having an ex-convict's child in class, while others were suddenly very interested in setting up playdates. Jake told the principal that Lily was the same kid she'd been a week ago, and nothing about his past had changed, but he could hear the doubt in the woman's voice when she said she'd handle it. On Thursday afternoon, exactly 7 days after the accident, Charlotte Ashford showed up at his apartment again. This time she was alone, dressed in jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Jake's monthly rent, and she looked tired in a way that made her seem almost human. "I need your help," she said without preamble when he opened the door. Jake crossed his arms. "With what?" Charlotte glanced over her shoulder at the empty hallway, then back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Someone's trying to kill me," she said quietly. "And I think you're the only person who can keep me alive." Jake stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but Charlotte's face remained serious. "The accident," she continued, her voice low and urgent. "It wasn't an accident. The police think the truck driver hit black ice, but I saw his face right before impact. He was looking right at me, aiming for me." She pulled out her phone and showed Jake a series of photos, screenshots of threatening messages, pictures of her leaving her building with a red circle drawn around her head, a news article about her father's company with the headline marked up in digital red ink, "Ashford Empire crumbles without air." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You should go to the police," he said, but Charlotte was already shaking her head. "I did. They said there's not enough evidence to prove intent. They think I'm paranoid because of the trauma." She looked at him with those pale blue eyes, and Jake saw real fear there for the first time. "Someone tried to kill me once already. They're going to try again." Jake wanted to say no. He wanted to close the door and go back to his simple, quiet life of driving strangers around the city and trying to be a better father. But he was already thinking about the check she'd given him, still sitting in his drawer because he hadn't been able to bring himself to cash it or throw it away. He was thinking about the way she'd said, "Thank you," like those words actually meant something. He was thinking about the security guard who died 12 years ago, the one Jake hadn't been able to save. "Why me?" he asked. Charlotte smiled grimly. "Because you're the only person I've met in the last 5 years who doesn't want something from me. And because you already proved you're willing to risk your life for mine." She paused, then added, "I'll pay you. A lot. Enough to get your daughter into any school in the city. Enough to move out of this neighborhood." Jake should have said no. Every instinct he'd developed in prison was screaming at him to walk away, to not get involved with rich people and their problems, to protect himself and Lily from whatever danger was circling Charlotte Ashford, like a shark. But he thought about his daughter saying she was proud of him, and he thought about the driver who'd died, while Jake had chosen to save someone else. And he heard himself say, "1 week, that's all I'm giving you." Charlotte's relief was visible, her shoulders dropping from their tense position. "Thank you," she said, and it sounded like she meant it. "I'll make the arrangements. You'll need to move into my building. There's a security apartment on the 20th floor. Bring your daughter. She'll be safe there, too." Jake started to protest, but Charlotte was already pulling out her phone, typing rapidly. "I'll have someone pack up your essentials and move them tonight. In the meantime, I need you to come with me now. There's a fundraiser at the Plaza Hotel in 3 hours, and I can't not show up without causing suspicion." She looked up from her phone, and Jake saw the steel underneath her polished exterior. "Whoever wants me dead is watching me closely. We can't let them know I'm on to them." Jake thought about Lily, who would be getting out of school in 2 hours. He thought about his car, his apartment, his life that was small and shabby, but his. Then he thought about a man dying alone in dark water, and he grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. "I need to call my daughter's school," he said. "She needs to know I'm picking her up early." Charlotte nodded. "We'll get her together. She'll like the new apartment. There's a library." 3 hours later, Jake stood in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, wearing a rented tuxedo that fit him better than anything he'd ever owned, surrounded by people who spent more on watches than he made in a year. Charlotte was across the room, smiling and shaking hands, and playing the role of gracious heiress, while Jake watched the crowd for threats he wasn't even sure how to identify. Lily was back at Charlotte's building with a woman Charlotte had introduced as her most trusted housekeeper, probably eating better food than she'd ever had in their apartment. Jake felt like an imposter in a world he didn't understand, and every person who looked at him seemed to see right through the expensive suit to the ex-con underneath. A man in his 50s approached Charlotte, embracing her with the kind of familiarity that made Jake's instincts prickle. He was tall and distinguished-looking, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Charlotte had mentioned her uncle earlier, her father's younger brother, who ran the day-to-day operations of the family company while Charlotte handled the public image. The uncle, Robert something, said something that made Charlotte laugh, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile went tight at the corners. Robert's eyes found Jake across the room, and something flickered in them. Recognition, calculation, dismissal. He said something else to Charlotte, who shook her head and pulled away from him, making her way through the crowd toward Jake with a glass of champagne in each hand. She handed him one and said quietly, "That's my Uncle Robert. He wants to know why I brought a bodyguard to a charity event." Jake took a sip of the champagne, which tasted like expensive bubbles, and nothing else. "What did you tell him?" "That after the accident I'm being careful." She smiled brightly for the benefit of anyone watching them, but her voice was low and urgent. "He didn't like it. He's been pushing me to take a leave of absence from the company, let him handle everything while I recover." Jake looked across the room at Robert Ashford, who was now talking to a group of men in suits, his body language relaxed and confident. "You think it's him?" Jake said. It wasn't a question. Charlotte's smile never wavered, but her eyes went hard. "He's the only person who benefits if I die. The company passes to him. The fortune, the properties, everything my father built." She took a long drink of champagne. "But I can't prove it. And if I'm wrong, I'll destroy the only family I have left." The rest of the evening passed in a haze of small talk and false smiles. Jake stayed close to Charlotte, hyper-aware of every person who approached her, every hand that reached out for a handshake, every waiter who came too close with a tray. By the time they left the plaza, he had a headache building behind his eyes and a new appreciation for how exhausting it must be to live Charlotte's life, always performing, always on guard. In the car back to her building, a sleek black sedan with a driver who Charlotte trusted enough to keep behind bulletproof glass. She finally let the mask drop. She slumped against the leather seat, kicked off her heels, and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she said without opening them, "for tonight, for not asking questions, for just being there." Jake looked at her profile in the dim light from the street lamp sliding past, at the sharp line of her jaw and the shadows under her eyes. She looked young and tired and scared, and something in his chest twisted uncomfortably. "You can't live like this forever," he said. Charlotte opened her eyes and looked at him. "I know. That's why I need you to help me find proof." The apartment she'd set up for him and Lily was nicer than anywhere Jake had ever lived. 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Lily was asleep in one of the bedrooms, curled up under a down comforter that probably cost more than their entire apartment back in Queens. And Jake stood at the window staring out at the city lights and wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into. His phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. "Meet me on the roof in 10 minutes. Don't let anyone see you." Jake considered ignoring it, going to bed and pretending he was just a simple bodyguard with a simple job. But he'd never been good at ignoring problems, even when he should have been. The roof of Charlotte's building was accessed by a private elevator that required a key card. When Jake stepped out into the cold night air, Charlotte was already there, leaning against the railing with a folder in her hands. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and she looked small against the backdrop of the Manhattan skyline. "I found something," she said, when Jake approached. She handed him the folder, and he opened it to find financial documents, spreadsheets, bank statements, emails. "My uncle has been moving money, a lot of money, millions of dollars into offshore accounts that don't show up in the company books." Jake flipped through the pages, not understanding most of what he was seeing, but recognizing the pattern. Money coming in, money going out, trails being covered. "This looks like embezzlement," he said. Charlotte nodded. "I think he's been stealing from the company for years. And I think my father found out right before he died." She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. "My father's death was ruled a heart attack. He was only 58. Healthy. Active. No history of heart problems." Jake felt that cold sensation in his stomach again. "You think your uncle killed him too?" "I think my uncle has killed everyone who stands between him and complete control of the Ashford fortune," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm the last one left." She looked at Jake with those winter sky eyes, and he saw the weight she'd been carrying alone. "I need help proving it. Real help. The kind that doesn't care about lawyers or corporate politics or family loyalty." Jake should have walked away right then. Should have taken Lily and gone back to their shabby apartment and their simple life. But he was already thinking about the security guard who died 12 years ago, about the driver who drowned while Jake had saved someone else, about all the ways he'd failed to do the right thing when it mattered. "Okay," he said, "but we do this my way. No more charity galas or playing nice. If your uncle is trying to kill you, we need to draw him out, make him make a mistake." Charlotte stared at him like he'd suggested they jump off the roof. "That's insane. If he makes a move, I could end up dead." Jake smiled grimly. "Not if I'm there to stop him. And this time, I won't let anyone die." The next 3 days were a careful dance of setting the trap. Charlotte made it known, through carefully placed conversations and strategic social posts, that she'd found irregularities in the company finances and was planning to bring them to the board on Monday morning. She mentioned meeting with federal investigators, hiring forensic accountants, bringing in outside auditors. Every move was designed to make Robert Ashford panic, to force him into action before Charlotte could expose him. Jake stayed close, but not obviously so. He learned the rhythms of Charlotte's building, the faces of the security guards, the patterns of who came and went. He noticed that Robert visited every evening around 6, always staying for exactly 30 minutes, always leaving through the parking garage instead of the main entrance. He noticed that one of the night security guards, a young guy named Patrick who was too friendly and asked too many questions, always seemed to be on duty when Robert visited. On Saturday evening, exactly 10 days after Jake had pulled Charlotte from the river, everything came together. Charlotte was in her apartment on the 40th floor, supposedly alone, reviewing documents for Monday's board meeting. Jake was in the security office watching the building's camera feeds, and he saw Patrick leave his post and take the service elevator up. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. "Someone just unlocked my door. It's not opening yet, but I can hear them in the hall." Jake was already moving, taking the stairs because the elevators were too slow, his heart pounding in his chest. He burst into Charlotte's hallway just as Patrick pushed open her apartment door, a syringe in his hand, filled with something that definitely wasn't medicine. Patrick saw Jake and ran, but Jake was faster, his body remembering lessons learned in prison about how to fight when your life depended on it. He caught Patrick in the stairwell, slammed him against the concrete wall, and held him there while Patrick struggled and cursed. "Who sent you?" Jake demanded, but he already knew the answer. Patrick's eyes were wild with panic, and he said nothing until Jake pressed harder against his windpipe. "Robert Ashford," Patrick finally gasped out. "He paid me $50,000 to make it look like she overdosed. Said she was unstable, said everyone would believe it." Jake felt sick. He pulled Patrick away from the wall and shoved him back toward Charlotte's apartment, where she was standing in the doorway with her phone in her hand. "I called the police," she said, her voice shaking. "They're on their way." Patrick lunged then, desperate, the syringe still in his hand. He went for Charlotte, and Jake moved without thinking, putting himself between them. The needle caught him in the shoulder, and he felt the burn of whatever poison was in it entering his bloodstream. Patrick tried to run again, but Jake held on, dragging him down even as his vision started to blur at the edges. Charlotte was screaming, and there were footsteps thundering up the stairs, and Jake thought distantly that at least this time, at least this once, he'd saved the right person. He woke up in a hospital room with Lily asleep in a chair next to his bed, and Charlotte standing by the window looking out at the city. His shoulder hurt, and his mouth tasted like cotton, but he was alive. When Charlotte heard him stir, she turned around, and there were tears on her face. "They pumped your stomach," she said. "You're going to be fine. The doctor said another minute and—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Jake looked at his daughter, still sleeping, her small hand wrapped around his. "Patrick?" he asked, his voice coming out rough. "In custody," Charlotte said. "He gave up my uncle in exchange for a plea deal. Robert's been arrested. They found evidence of the embezzlement, the payments to Patrick, communications about," her voice broke, "about my father. They think Robert poisoned him, made it look like a heart attack." She sat down on the edge of Jake's hospital bed, careful not to disturb the IV in his arm. "You saved my life again," she said quietly. "How many times does that make?" Jake thought about the driver who died in the river, about the security guard who died 12 years ago, about all the ways he'd tried and failed to do the right thing. "Not enough," he said, but Charlotte was shaking her head. "More than enough," she said firmly. "More than anyone had the right to expect from you." She reached out and took his free hand, the one that wasn't holding Lily's, and squeezed it. "I'm going to testify against my uncle, put him away for what he did to my father, what he tried to do to me. And after that's done, I want to start a foundation to help people like you, people who made mistakes but deserve a second chance." Jake looked at this woman who'd been a stranger 10 days ago, who'd become something he didn't have a name for yet, and felt something shift in his chest. The guilt that had lived there for 12 years was still there, probably always would be, but it felt smaller now, manageable, like maybe he could carry it without it crushing him. "I don't need your charity," he said, but there was no heat in it. Charlotte smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. It's not charity, it's justice, and you're going to help me run it. Someone needs to make sure I don't just write checks and call it helping. She stood up, smoothing down her skirt. Besides, you owe me. I'm paying for this hospital room, and it's very expensive. Jake laughed, which hurt his shoulder, and Lily stirred in her chair. She opened her eyes and saw Jake awake, and her whole face lit up. Dad. She scrambled onto the bed, careful of his IV, and wrapped her arms around his neck. The doctors said you were poisoned. They said you might die. Jake held his daughter close, breathing in the smell of her shampoo, and met Charlotte's eyes over Lily's head. I'm okay, Lily Pad, he said. I'm okay. 6 months later, Jake stood in the courtroom gallery and watched Robert Ashford get sentenced to 30 years in federal prison for murder, attempted murder, embezzlement, and a list of other charges that took the judge 5 minutes to read. Charlotte sat in the front row, her back straight and her face composed, but Jake could see her hand shaking in her lap. When it was over, when Robert had been led away in handcuffs, Charlotte turned around and found Jake in the crowd. She didn't smile, but something passed between them. Understanding, relief, the acknowledgement of a burden finally set down. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them with questions and cameras, but Charlotte's lawyer ran interference, while Jake guided her to the waiting car. Lily was already inside, reading a book from the library at Charlotte's building, which Jake had decided to accept when Charlotte offered to let them stay as long as they needed. He'd cash the check, too, eventually, and put it all in a college fund for Lily. It had stopped feeling like a reward and started feeling like what it actually was, a gift from someone who understood what it meant to be saved. In the car, Charlotte leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. It's over, she said, like she couldn't quite believe it. It's really over. Jake looked at his daughter, safe and happy, and reading about dragons or wizards, or whatever kids her age read about, and then at Charlotte, who trusted him with her life when she had no reason to. Yeah, he said. It's over. But it wasn't really over, not in the way endings usually worked. It was more like a beginning, like the moment when you finally put down something heavy you'd been carrying for too long and realize you can breathe again. The Ashford Foundation for Second Chances opened 3 months later in a renovated building in Queens, not far from where Jake's old apartment had been. Charlotte cut the ribbon while cameras flashed, and Jake stood off to the side in a suit that actually belonged to him this time, watching her give a speech about redemption and opportunity and the importance of believing that people could change. Lily stood next to him, holding his hand, and when Charlotte mentioned Jake by name, called him the Foundation's Director of Outreach, said he was proof that one moment of courage could change everything, Lily squeezed his hand tight and whispered, "That's my dad." After the ceremony, after the reporters had left and the crowd had dispersed, Charlotte found Jake in the Foundation's library, which she'd insisted on including because she said everyone deserved access to stories about people who'd been broken and found ways to be whole again. "What do you think?" she asked, gesturing at the shelves of books, the comfortable chairs, the windows that let in the afternoon light. Jake walked to the window and looked out at the street below, at the neighborhood where he'd struggled to make rent and keep his daughter fed. From up here, it looked different, not smaller, exactly, but more manageable, like a place where good things could happen. "I think," he said slowly, "that 12 years ago I made the worst mistake of my life. And I think 10 months ago I finally did something right." He turned to face Charlotte, who was watching him with those winter sky eyes that had seen him at his worst and somehow found something worth saving. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me the chance to do something right." Charlotte smiled, and it was warm and real and nothing like the polished mask she wore for the cameras. You gave yourself that chance, she said. When you jumped in the river. When you chose to save someone instead of walking away. She moved closer, standing next to him at the window. I've been thinking about that night a lot. About what you said in the hospital. About how it wasn't enough. All the saving you'd done. She looked at him sidelong. Do you still think that? Jake thought about the security guard, whose name had been Walter Bennett, and who'd had 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. He thought about the driver, whose name had been Paul Rodriguez, and who'd been sending money home to family in Puerto Rico. He would never be able to save them. They would always be part of his history, part of the weight he carried. But maybe, he thought, that was okay. Maybe the point wasn't to erase the past, but to build something better on top of it. I think, he said carefully, that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for the mistakes I made. And I think that's not a bad way to live. Charlotte nodded, satisfied, and they stood there in comfortable silence, watching the city move below them. Somewhere in the building, Lily was talking to the program coordinator about the summer camp they were planning, her voice bright with excitement. Somewhere in Manhattan, Robert Ashford sat in a cell and paid for his crimes. And somewhere in the Hudson River, a security guard and a driver rested in peace, their deaths meaning something because Jake Morrison had decided they would. It wasn't redemption, not really. Redemption was too clean a word for the messy work of trying to be better. But it was something. It was enough. That evening, Jake drove Lily home to Charlotte's building in the car she'd bought him for the foundation. Practical, reliable, nothing flashy. Lily chattered about her day, about the girl she'd met whose mom was in the foundation's job training program, about how they were going to be best friends. Jake listened and made the right noises and felt the unfamiliar sensation of contentment settling over him like a warm blanket. When they got back to the apartment, Charlotte was waiting in the hallway with takeout from the Italian place Lily liked. She'd started joining them for dinner a few nights a week, at first because she said she needed to discuss foundation business with Jake, and later because no one bothered to make excuses anymore. They ate together in the apartment that still felt too nice to be real, and Lily told Charlotte about her day with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for Christmas morning. Charlotte listened like it was the most important thing she'd ever heard, and Jake watched them and thought about how strange it was that the worst night of his life, diving into freezing water to save a stranger, had somehow led to this, to family dinners and foundation work, and a life that felt like it meant something beyond just surviving. After Lily went to bed, Jake and Charlotte sat on the couch with glasses of wine, the city lights spread out below them like fallen stars. I've been thinking, Charlotte said, swirling her wine, about what comes next, for the foundation, for, she paused, for us. Jake looked at her, at the way the lamplight caught in her blonde hair, at the small scar on her temple from the accident that had brought them together. What about us? He asked, even though he knew what she meant. Had known for months, probably, but had been too afraid to acknowledge it. Charlotte set down her wine glass and turned to face him fully. You saved my life twice, Jake Morrison, and somewhere along the way, I think I might have saved yours too. So I'm wondering, now that we're both alive, now that we're both free, what do we do with that? Jake thought about all the reasons this was a bad idea. The class difference, the media attention, the way people would talk about the ex-con and the billionaire heiress. He thought about how Charlotte deserved better than someone with his history, his baggage, his ghosts. But then he thought about the way she'd trusted him when she had no reason to, the way she'd seen past his mistakes to something worth believing in. He thought about second chances and redemption, and the possibility that sometimes people who'd been broken could help each other heal. I think, he said slowly, reaching out to take her hand, that we figure it out as we go, together. Charlotte smiled, and Jake leaned in to kiss her. Not the desperate, life-saving kiss of that first night on the bridge, but something slower and softer and full of promise. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his and whispered, "Thank you for jumping in the river." Jake laughed, and it felt good, felt right in a way that nothing had in 12 years. "Thank you for being worth saving," he said. Outside, the city hummed with life. Millions of people living their own stories of mistakes and redemptions, losses and findings. And in an apartment 40 floors above it all, a man who'd spent 12 years running from his past finally stopped running and chose to stay. Not because he'd earned it, or because he deserved it, but because sometimes life gave you a second chance in the form of a car crash and a frozen river and a woman with winter sky eyes who saw something in you worth saving. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you were brave enough to take it. The end.